So up to this episode, we have two groups of men who are trying to kill Joseph Smith, those outside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, citizens of Illinois who were publishing material against the prophet through their newspaper, the Warsaw Signal. And we also have those who have recently left the Restored Church of Jesus Christ and begun work on their new newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor. This week, the church starts publishing a newspaper of their own in New York City called The Prophet. And this third newspaper symbolizes a third group of people who want to kill Joseph Smith, his national political enemies. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. We've talked a lot about how before a large portion of the Latter-day Saints lived in western Illinois, they were in Missouri, and how they were finally driven out of Missouri after the governor, Governor Boggs, passed an extermination order, Executive Order 44. And that order legalized the extermination and driving out of all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Missouri. And in fact, the moment that Executive Order 44 begins to be carried out, Joseph Smith and a lot of the Latter-day Saints are in Far West, Missouri. That's the name of the city, Far West. And they see, while they're there, the state militia marching out to them across the plains, and they think to themselves, finally, the militia has come to protect us from these mobs that keep attacking us. But the militia hadn't come to protect them. A messenger was sent out, letting the Latter-day Saints know that it had come to massacre them. Now, through a series of events, that massacre wouldn't happen. Instead, Joseph Smith and other church leaders are taken to jail, and the rest of the saints are kicked out of the state. And remember, this isn't the first time that they've had their property stolen and their homes destroyed in Missouri, because mobs kicked all the members of the church out of Jackson County, Missouri, 5 years earlier. So now, 4 to 5 years after being kicked out of Far West, the main body of members of the church live in Nauvoo, Illinois, and the nation is starting to gear up for a presidential election. So Joseph Smith and the church leadership write letters to some of the national political figures who were running for president, trying to figure out what they would do regarding helping the Latter-day Saints regain their property and land as has been stolen from Missouri if they were to be elected president. They're trying to figure out who is going to help them and who they can support. One of the men they write a letter to is Henry Clay. Henry is a United States senator from Kentucky. Now, Senator Clay writes back saying that even though he acknowledges that these Latter-day Saints have endured injustice, that he can't make promises to any particular portion of the people of the United States, as he doesn't want to become president with a lot of obligations to special interest groups. And Joseph also writes back and forth with John C. Calhoun. And in between their letters, John goes from being a United States Senator from South Carolina to the United States Secretary of State. And Secretary of State Calhoun said the same thing, essentially, as Henry Clay, that he could not favor certain groups of Americans over others. He also added that he didn't think these persecutions by the state of Missouri fell underneath the jurisdiction of the federal government. Joseph Smith had actually met John Calhoun 5 years earlier when he went to Washington, D.C. Joseph had traveled to Washington, D.C. after being kicked out of Missouri. He went to try and get the federal government to help him and his followers get their stuff back from Missouri. While in Washington, John C. Calhoun told the prophet the same thing he said in the letter. He cannot offer them any help. Another individual that Joseph met while he was in Washington was the President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. Joseph met with President Van Buren and explained to him the extermination order against himself and the members of this church and their lost land and property, and he explained all their persecutions in Missouri that they'd experienced, and Joseph argued for their protection and for their redress. He argued his case before President Van Buren as a First Amendment issue. Joseph and his followers were not being allowed to practice their religion freely. But at the time, the Constitution of the United States only limited the federal government. And President Van Buren, according to the then current understanding of the Constitution, looked at Joseph's appeal to the First Amendment and freedom of religion as unrelated to their problems in Missouri. That was a state issue, not a federal one. So Van Buren told him, quote, "I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I shall come in contact with the whole state of Missouri," end quote. So now, 4 years after not finding any help for his people in Washington, Joseph is still upset. The persecution of Latter-day Saints has been ignored by almost every politician at the county, state, and then federal level. And the presidential election is starting to pick up steam, and leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is talking about all the potential candidates they could vote for. And the prophet says that it is, quote, morally impossible, end quote, for the Latter-day Saints to vote to re-elect President Van Buren. After all, he said, and he told them the federal government could do nothing to help them and all these Latter-day Saints who had been robbed, murdered, and attacked by the state of Missouri. And so the letters that they're sharing back and forth with Senators Clay and Senators Calhoun make them feel like they cannot also vote for them. So probably realizing there was no other option, Willard Richards, one of Joseph Smith's scribes and one of his friends at a meeting of church leadership, nominates Joseph Smith for the next president. And everyone in the room unanimously agrees. Joseph tells them that he will accept the nomination, but that they all have to go all over the country to electioneer or campaign for his presidency, or for his candidacy. Joseph believed that there were enough experienced, quality speakers in the church that he could win the presidency on his very first try. Well, a few months after Joseph decides to run, and a month before Joseph's death, the state convention of a political party is held in an assembly room above one of Nauvoo's general stores. Now, because Joseph was running as a third-party candidate, this is an independent convention or third-party convention, and it was set to precede a national convention that the Latter-day Saints would hold back east in Baltimore, Maryland later in the year. And while there, Joseph Smith was nominated as a candidate for president, but Joseph couldn't attend the meeting actually himself because his wife Emma was sick. She had been sick all day, so Joseph stayed home to take care of her. Well, as he's taking care of his wife, suddenly he hears noises in the streets outside. He looks out his window and sees a barrel of tar burning in the middle of the road. And a large crowd of people gathered around. He goes to investigate and see what's going on. Well, as he approaches the crowd, he finds that there are a group of Nauvoo citizens giving toasts. When they see him, they run at him and grab him and carry him around the fire, lifted up on their shoulders. They then carry him back to his home, the Nauvoo mansion, escorted by a band of music. They were celebrating that Joseph Smith had just been chosen by the Nauvoo State Convention as its third-party candidate for the President of the United States of America. Now, Joseph's presidential candidacy is going to complicate his life because it feeds into one of the most basic claims that had been made against Joseph since he founded the Restored Church of Jesus Christ. And the claim that Joseph's presidential candidacy feeds into is that Joseph Smith was this power-hungry guy attempting to overthrow the United States government and start a theocracy. This rumor started in Ohio back in 1831 when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was only 1 year old and Joseph himself was 25. And when this claim first started 13 years earlier, one of the main pieces of evidence Joseph's enemies used to support their theory was that Joseph taught that he was the only person that could receive revelation, or guidance or direction for the entire church or even the world. Now, revelation here means a metaphysical experience where knowledge or wisdom is transmitted from a higher source. So through the Holy Spirit, Joseph learns a doctrine, or through a vision or a dream or communication with an angel, Joseph receives knowledge or wisdom from the Lord, and then he turns around and shares it with the church. And Joseph taught that he was the only one who could receive revelation like this for the whole church, but that everyone could receive revelation like this for their personal lives. And that's where all the teachings and doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints came from up to this point. They came from visions and revelations that Joseph Smith received. Well, the church's early enemies, some of whom again were members of the church itself, thought that this was totalitarian. They thought that it was dictatorial. They believed that everyone deserved to teach truth and guide the direction of the church and set out doctrines and dogmas, not just Joseph Smith. They believed that if one of the members of the church had a dream of a new doctrine or teaching, that it should be a valid doctrine for the entire religion. And Joseph, meanwhile, and his most ardent supporters viewed Joseph's structure as a way to preserve order. To understand Joseph Smith better, I think you have to understand that Joseph Smith views himself in the context of Moses and Abraham and the great prophets of the Old and New Testament, and his followers do too. So it's like in the Old Testament when Moses came down from the mountain after communicating with God, and he brings with him commandments. And he comes down to see the children of Israel worshiping a false idol. They're worshiping a golden calf that Moses' brother Aaron made for them. When Moses saw the golden calf, he did not say, "That's cool, you guys can pray to that too." Moses got angry and he broke the commandments and he told them to only worship one God. God's commandments would come through him, Moses. And that's how Joseph was when it came to revelations for the church. God's commandments would come through him. And that mentality rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But that was just 13 years ago when Joseph was the 25-year-old leader of a really new, really small religion. Now, Joseph is a 38-year-old prophet to over 20,000 people. But not only is his church bigger, because at a local level, almost everyone that lives in Nauvoo is a Latter-day Saint. That means Joseph is the spiritual leader of an entire city. And on top of it, Joseph is that city's mayor. Joseph is the mayor of Nauvoo, so he's the city's governmental leader. And then on top of that, Joseph is the lieutenant general of Nauvoo's militia, the Nauvoo Legion. So he's the city's military leader. Actually, Joseph Smith's title of lieutenant general at the time made him the highest ranked militia member in the entire United States, as every other militia only had major generals as their highest ranked officer. So he's a prophet, a mayor, a lieutenant general, and now a third-party candidate for the president of the United States of America. Now, these people who used to think that Joseph was trying to set himself up as a king are now really thinking that. And this is why in William Law's prospectus for his newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, and this is the prospectus that we mentioned at the end of the last episode, this is why William Law advocates, quote, unmitigated disobedience to Joseph's political revelations, end quote. And he refers to Joseph Smith as a, quote, self-constituted monarch, end quote, and encourages people to, quote, oppose with uncompromising hostility any union of church and state, end quote. And that's why William Law says in his prospectus that the sacred duty of the Nauvoo Expositor is the, quote, unconditional repeal of the Nauvoo City Charter, end quote. The Nauvoo City Charter is the legal document that allowed the city of Nauvoo to exist as a city. Repealing the city charter would mean the mayor would no longer have authority in the city. The city council and the judges, a majority of which were Latter-day Saints, would no longer have authority within the city. The civic authority would revert to the Justice of the Peace in Carthage, who is a leader of the anti-Mormon party. Joseph would also no longer be the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, because the Nauvoo Legion would no longer exist, as it existed solely as an outgrowth of the Nauvoo City Charter. If the Nauvoo Expositor accomplishes its goal of repealing the Nauvoo Charter, Joseph will lose 2 of his 3 leadership roles. His power, at least at the local level, would be severely curbed. So for all these enemies of Joseph Smith, who had all along, when he was penniless and jobless and without a home, when he was a refugee living off of the kindness of strangers, for all these people who had all along been worried that this man was going to take over the world, now they're really worried. So for William Law and for Thomas Sharp and the anti-Mormons, the best way to start to curb Joseph's power, they believe, is to get rid of Nauvoo's city charter. And so you can better understand why people are scared of Joseph and the Latter-day Saints outside of the reasons that we've talked about, and so you can better understand Joseph's directions and thoughts during the last 6 months of his life. I'm going to talk to you about the Kingdom of Daniel. Now, the Kingdom of Daniel is a reference to a dream that a king had in the book of Daniel, which is a book in the Old Testament in the Bible. And in the book of Daniel, this takes place about 600 BC, over in the Middle East. The king of Babylon, a man named Nebuchadnezzar, comes into Jerusalem and kills a lot of people. He takes over the place and he carries slaves off back to Babylon. And that's normal for Babylon. It's what the Babylonians would do when they took over places. They would take prisoners back to their capital as a way to build some sort of relationship between themselves and their conquered civilizations. So Nebuchadnezzar takes these Israelites back to Babylon, and they're held captive, and one of them is a man named Daniel. And the king one night has a dream, and in the dream he sees a giant statue of a man, and the statue's head is made out of gold, and the rest of his body is made out of silver and brass and iron, and then a mixture of iron and clay all the way down to his toes. Well, in the dream, a giant stone gets cut out of a mountain, and it comes down this mountain, and it gets bigger and bigger and crashes into the statue, and it breaks it into pieces. Well, it doesn't just break the statue to pieces, but it obliterates the statue and turns it to dust. And the dust is so fine that it gets carried away in the wind. And then the stone becomes a great mountain itself and fills the whole earth. So the Babylonian king is scared by this dream. Now, Daniel eventually tells the king what this dream was and offers him an interpretation. And the king believes Daniel's interpretation of this dream because the king didn't tell anyone the particulars of the dream. So when Daniel gives him these secret details of the dream that only the king knew, and then follows it up with an explanation, the king knows that Daniel knows. So Daniel tells the king that this statue and its various parts represent the great kingdoms of the world, with Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire being the golden head of the statue. Daniel tells the king that at some point in the future, a stone is going to be formed and completely obliterate these political organizations on the earth and take their place. Except instead of taking their place as a statue, it's going to take their place as a mountain that will stand forever and fill the whole earth. So Joseph Smith, outside of his political career as a candidate for the president of the United States, Joseph is preaching that he wants to create a political organization that will help this stone roll down the mountain to eventually destroy or take the place of all other political organizations. And Joseph isn't secretive about this. He's preaching about it. In one sermon in Nauvoo, he said, quote, "I calculate to be one of the instruments of setting up the kingdom of Daniel by the word of the Lord," end quote. Joseph said that he wants to, quote, "lay a foundation that will revolutionize the world," end quote. That's dangerous talk there. Joseph said he wants to revolutionize the world. People are scared of revolutions, and they're scared of revolutionaries because revolutions overthrow the status quo. But again, this desire of Joseph isn't new. It isn't new to Joseph in 1844, and it's not something that he desires now that he's running for president. When Joseph was in Missouri 5 years earlier, we talked about how he was in Liberty Jail. Well, his actual charges, what got him in jail, or one of the charges, was this charge of treason. And we talked about how Orson Hyde, one of the members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, had left the church briefly and testified at that trial against Joseph Smith that resulted in him being thrown in jail. Well, when they first tried to charge Joseph with treason in Missouri, it was partially based on this idea that Joseph wanted to establish the kingdom of Daniel on earth. Now, the majority of people in America at the time are Christians, and they're familiar with the Bible, and they know exactly what it means to establish the kingdom of Daniel. They know that it means that existing political organizations would be destroyed so thoroughly that they would be turned into fine dust and carried away in the wind. And so this idea of smashing and destroying and pulverizing existing political structures was, to the Americans on the frontier, violent. So when Joseph preached that he wanted to, quote, "be one of the instruments of setting up the kingdom of Daniel by the word of the Lord," end quote, all they heard Joseph saying was, "I want to destroy everything, smash it, and pulverize it until it's a dust that's so fine it gets blown away in the wind." So as Joseph, back in Missouri, is being prosecuted for treason, the prosecutors bring this up as evidence against Joseph. But the judge tells them that he can't jail Joseph Smith for wanting to establish the kingdom of Daniel, because then you'd have to jail every Christian in America. The judge says that reading the Bible would be treasonous because technically, in the judge's reasoning, all Christians want God's promised kingdom to come to earth. They're just not going around actually trying to do it. Regardless, Joseph was still charged with treason in Missouri, but not because of this desire to establish the kingdom of Daniel on earth. Just to let you know what he ended up actually getting charged with treason for, we talked earlier about how Joseph was in Far West, and he saw the state militia marching across the plains, and he thought that they were going to save him from the mobs. But the militia was actually there to massacre the Latter-day Saints under Governor Boggs' executive order. You remember Executive Order 44. Well, after sending out a messenger to tell the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that they were there to massacre them, the militia camped just outside the city for the night. And so all night long, the Latter-day Saints in the city and a few of their non-Latter-day Saint friends were tearing down fences and sheds and pig pens to build fortifications to protect themselves during the upcoming battle. They figured that if they were all going to die, when the morning came, they wanted to try and give themselves as good of a chance as they could to fight back and stay alive. Well, because the militia was sent there to massacre the citizens under orders of the governor, the fortifications they stayed up all night building were seen as treasonous. The Latter-day Saints, in attempting to protect their lives, were actually disobeying executive orders that they be killed. And so the men who stayed up all night building them were committing treason. And the Latter-day Saints, it was claimed, should have just accepted the will of the government and allowed themselves to be murdered. Now, because Joseph Smith was helping build the fortifications, Joseph Smith was guilty of treason. Now, if that sounds insane, people in Missouri figured out that that was insane, and the charges didn't stick. And eventually, the government of Missouri realized that they couldn't charge people with treason for building fortifications to protect themselves from an impending government-sanctioned massacre. But the government also realized it couldn't let Joseph Smith, who was public enemy number one, walk out of jail to freedom, or it wouldn't be able to control the populist outrage. Because remember, this is still the American frontier, and Missouri admits that it has a tenuous control over its citizens. So in a sort of compromise, Joseph and other leaders of the church in jail are allowed to escape from their guards in Missouri, which is how they end up in Illinois and Nauvoo. They actually walked to Illinois through backwoods to avoid vigilante mobs, the same way that Porter would after being let out of jail and making his way back to Joseph's Christmas party. But I say all this to let you know that Joseph wants to establish a political organization that is described in the Bible as being a destructive force, and this makes his neighbors scared. Now, to add more nuance to it, even though Joseph is preaching that, at the same time, Joseph is preaching and teaching that this political organization that will take over the whole world won't be violent, and it won't force people to enter into it. In one speech, he says, quote, "It will not be by sword or gun that this kingdom will roll on. The power of truth is such that all nations will be under the necessity of obeying the gospel," end quote. Joseph looks at this giant stone growing out of the mountain as being so impressive, and he looks at the government that it will create as being so impressive and full of so much truth and goodness that people will voluntarily leave their own political organizations behind and join his. He sees governments being destroyed by people abandoning them, not by his political organization crushing theirs through war and conquering. This is the same principle, by the way, with which Joseph governed people as prophet of the restored Church of Jesus Christ and as mayor. When visitors would come to meet Joseph and visit Nauvoo, they would regularly say, "Hey, we're really impressed with how good you are controlling all these people that follow you. How do you do it?" And Joseph tells them all, "I don't govern these people. I teach them the correct principles and let them govern themselves. I teach them what the Lord has revealed to me, and they control themselves." End quote. So as a prophet, Joseph expects to show people greater truths, greater principles, greater laws than they currently know or understand, and then have them leave their old ways to join his new ways. This governing principle that Joseph uses is probably the same reason why there are so many people who leave Joseph's church and start to fight against it. There's nothing keeping them there except themselves. There's no outside compulsion. Joseph as a prophet wasn't and couldn't force them to obey. So converts join the religion, and then when these Latter-day Saints are over it, they just leave and start fighting against it. Now that being said, a lot of people don't believe Joseph's claim that the power of the truth that he teaches is going to be so strong that people will voluntarily submit to his new political organization. They think Joseph is, in their own words, an American Muhammad, who is going to gather up an army and force everyone into some sort of Latter-day Saint caliphate. They think that Joseph is going to march his Nauvoo Legion all across America and kill everyone until they join his church. They think that Joseph is saying one thing and doing another thing. They think that he's preaching peace but getting ready for war. The Latter-day Saints say that Joseph is running for president because it's morally impossible for the Latter-day Saints to vote for a politician who did not support their being given their land and property back that was taken from them in Missouri. Joseph is running for president from a city built by refugees from war who are only trying to protect themselves. But the anti-Mormons and people that have just left Joseph's church say that that story is a front, and that Joseph is running for president because he wants to destroy the American government from the inside out and start his own. And they believe that the city that was built by refugees, Nauvoo, Illinois, is actually a growing danger. So we have talked about two political storylines going on at once in the last 6 months of Joseph's life. One is this idea of Joseph establishing the kingdom of Daniel, and the other is Joseph's presidential campaign. While the third political story that Joseph has going on at the same time is that he and a group of men are trying to figure out a place that the Latter-day Saints can go to be safe from persecution. These Latter-day Saints were kicked out of Ohio. We haven't really talked about that, but a group of Latter-day Saints were kicked out of Ohio early on in the church's founding. Well, from Ohio, these members of the restored Church of Jesus Christ were kicked out of Missouri. And now out of Missouri, their enemies are starting to grow their organizations in Illinois. And Joseph and the church just want to get away from the persecution. They're looking for a place to relocate to again, hopefully finally, or hopefully for a final time. And right now, the two areas that they are most interested in escaping to are Oregon and Texas. So Joseph sends a group of men to try and secure a tract of land for the Latter-day Saints to settle in Texas. And at the time, Texas isn't in the United States of America. It's the Republic of Texas, and it's its own country. So a Latter-day Saint delegation from Nauvoo goes to Texas to talk with Sam Houston. And Joseph also sends two other men back to Washington, D.C., two Orsons, Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt. This is the same Orson Hyde, you'll remember, that left the church in Missouri because he claimed Joseph wanted too much power. Orson came back to the church, went a mission across the world to Palestine and Jerusalem, and is now going to Washington, D.C. on behalf of Joseph Smith. And again, I want to remind everyone listening that while Joseph is going through all these personal events that lead up to his death, everyone around him is also going through these wild stories. All the men and women in the church are dealing with their own spiritual lives as history rolls on around them. And Orson Hyde and the other Orson Pratt, are trying to get two things from the federal government when they visit Washington, D.C. One, they're trying to get reparations for their persecutions and stolen property in Missouri. And two, they want Congress to give Joseph the authority to gather up an army and go settle Oregon Territory, a territory over which Britain and America have joint custody. Well, while these two things are happening, at the same time, Latter-day Saints go to New York City, and they start printing a newspaper called The Prophet. And The Prophet is a political newspaper whose goal is to get Joseph Smith elected as president. And the men running this newspaper, one of whom is Joseph Smith's brother, are not trying to hide Joseph Smith's religious claims to get him elected. It's not like they're trying to figure out how to make Joseph Smith less of a prophet or less of a religious leader so they can sell his presidency to the East Coast. In fact, they're embracing it. They say in the second issue of their New York paper that, quote, they place before the world as a candidate for the chief magistracy of this republic the prophet of the last days, General Joseph Smith of Nauvoo, Illinois, end quote. They refer to their presidential candidate as, quote, the renowned and mysterious prophet of the West, end quote. So their whole point is, Joseph Smith is God's prophet, vote for him for president, obviously. And immediately on the national level, this starts to raise flags with newspapers about a presidential candidate who claims to speak with God and visit with angels and receive revelations. They start to say, we don't know if this is real or not. We don't know if this presidency or this candidacy is a joke or if the prophet really thinks he can win, but we need to be cautious here. Now, to top all these things off that create political friction between Joseph and his enemies, on top of the kingdom of Daniel, which is the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, and on top of Joseph's local power and influence, and the Latter-day Saints voting bloc, and the fact that Joseph is asking Congress to give him authority to raise up an army to go out to Oregon, is a very simple problem that Joseph Smith is a third-party presidential candidate in the American political system. America at the time has two political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs would later split and become the Republican Party, but now, as a third-party candidate, Joseph Smith is going to pull votes away from the Whigs. And the Whigs know that, and they can't have it. Well, we talked earlier in this episode about all these letters that Joseph Smith is writing to and getting back from leading national political figures. Well, these letters that he has been writing back and forth with these leaders are being published all over the country in newspapers. Joseph's letters and Henry Clay's letters and John Calhoun's letters. And not only are these letters being reprinted, but Latter-day Saint newspaper in Nauvoo and Thomas Sharp's anti-Mormon newspaper in Warsaw are publishing editorials on the letters. And those editorials are getting printed and mailed out to all the major newspapers across the country as well. So newspaper men are not only reading Joseph Smith arguing with national politicians, they're reading local Illinois newspapers arguing about Joseph Smith's arguing. And there's a little political storm, and it's getting riled up more and more by all these members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that are getting sent out as electioneers to try and drum up votes for Joseph. And these are hybrid electioneers / missionaries, because we talked about the New York City newspaper, The Prophet, as saying, vote for Joseph Smith because he's God's prophet in these last days. Well, the electioneers are saying the same thing. They're preaching the gospel of the restored Church of Jesus Christ, and they're preaching about the restoration of God's priesthood through Joseph Smith while trying to get people to vote for Joseph. But these are hundreds of men and women leaving Nauvoo as electioneers for Joseph Smith. They're very excited about Joseph running for president. A lot of them are leaving on steamboats from Nauvoo, and on the steamboats they're preaching the doctrine of their new religion to people and campaigning for Joseph Smith. And they're holding mock elections to see how the people on the steamboats are going to vote, to gauge public interest. And because the steamboats are leaving out of heavily, Latter-day Saint Nauvoo, Joseph Smith is winning easily every one of these steamboat polls. And so this is only making these electioneers more excited and more focused to get Joseph elected as president as they go out across the country. And the main tract that they use in their campaigning was a pamphlet that Joseph Smith had written called Views of the Power and Policy of the Government of the United States. And one of the policies that Joseph outlines in this pamphlet is prison reform. Joseph thought that all prisons should be taken down and that only murderers should be put in them. And Joseph said that it wasn't fair to put people in jail and expect them to reform or pay off debts and then get back on their feet somehow and get back into society. So that was just, one of the points in his platform. And so most of these electioneers are going out and they're printing out copies of Joseph's Views of the Government pamphlet, and they're printing them out by the thousands, and they're reading them on stumps and handing them out to people. And a lot of people that these Latter-day Saint electioneers talk to think Joseph Smith is either insane or genius. And a side effect of all these missionaries leaving to electioneer for Joseph's presidential campaign is that Joseph's friends are leaving Nauvoo. They're going back east to Boston and New York and Pennsylvania and drumming up votes. And Joseph has many close friends and trusted associates, but some of his most ardent supporters and fiery advocates, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball among the foremost, have left Nauvoo to go, to electioneer for his presidential campaign. And we talked earlier about how the second highest governing body in the church was called the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Well, by the time Joseph Smith is brought to Carthage, Illinois, only 2 of the 12 apostles are left in Nauvoo. Everyone else is gone. And they're leaving right in the middle of William Law's secret meetings and the oaths to assent to their leader's destruction. And William Law and his supporters are becoming more and more outspoken against the prophet. They've started to openly disregard city rules. They don't listen to the sheriff, and they want to see the entire city destroyed. And Joseph's trusted friends are leaving, while in Nauvoo, Joseph is continuing to fight against William Law, the new prophet of this Reformation church. And William Law's anti-Joseph Smith newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, has gotten its press in, and it's getting close to publishing its first issue. And all these close followers of Joseph are leaving to go back east, while Thomas Sharp's anti-Mormon paper, the Warsaw Signal, continues to rail against them, speaking out against Joseph, making veiled threats against their safety. It's a very electric environment. But these people are not oblivious to the dangerous situation they're leaving. In fact, one of the 12 apostles of the church, Wilford Woodruff, who ends up leaving as an electioneer, doesn't want to go to earn the votes for Joseph. He wants to stay back in Nauvoo and help. But Joseph tells him that he must leave to campaign for his presidential election. Joseph tells Wilford that if he stays in Nauvoo, he'll be killed, because the prophet can feel his death coming. We have 3 groups of people who want to destroy Joseph Smith. We have the local anti-Mormons, led by Thomas Sharp, the members of the Reformation Church, led by William Law, and now these members of a national political scene, which is kind of a more nebulous group, but they're starting to become scared and concerned about this third-party presidential candidate. Well, in the next episode, a match is lit, and the fire keg that has been building up underneath Joseph Smith goes off. Scripts of each podcast episode can be found at our website, www.pilgrimspodcast.com. Music for this episode is from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley, and the dialogue was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff.